When people think of media powerhouses who shaped modern television, one name rises above the rest: Oprah Winfrey. For decades, she built her reputation on empathy, truth-telling, and giving voice to those who were often ignored. On the other side of a very different legacy stands Jeffrey Epstein, a man whose wealth, influence, and secretive life eventually exploded into one of the most disturbing scandals of the 21st century. This is not a story about a courtroom confrontation. It is not about a single viral moment. It is about something deeper: how public conversation, survivor testimony, and media platforms intersected to force hidden truths into the light. In this first part, we explore the climate that allowed Epstein to rise, the cultural silence that protected him, and how media figures, including Oprah, played a role in changing the narrative around power, abuse, and accountability. The making of a powerful illusion. Before his crimes became widely known, Epstein carefully constructed an image of sophistication and success. He moved among billionaires, politicians, academics, and celebrities. He donated to institutions, cultivated friendships, and projected intellectual credibility. The public image was clear: a mysterious financier, a connector of elites, a philanthropist interested in science and education. Behind closed doors, however, survivors would later describe a far darker reality, one of manipulation, exploitation, and systemic abuse. For years, rumors circulated quietly, yet nothing seemed to stick. Questions surfaced, but consequences did not follow in proportion to the allegations. That imbalance between accusation and accountability became one of the central tensions of the Epstein saga: a culture of silence. To understand how truth eventually surfaced, we must understand why it remained hidden for so long. The late 1990s and early 2000s were not an era where survivors of abuse were consistently believed, especially when accusations involved powerful men. Wealth created distance, influence created protection, fear created silence. Epstein's connections spanned global circles. His private jet, properties, and social gatherings created a web of association that intimidated many. The fear of reputational damage alone kept some from speaking openly. But cultural shifts were coming. The power of survivor testimony. Long before the public fully grasped the scale of Epstein's crimes, survivors were trying to be heard. Their voices were fragmented, scattered, and often dismissed. Yet they persisted. One of the reasons the narrative eventually changed was the growing space in media for survivor-centered storytelling. Talk shows, documentaries, and investigative programs began prioritizing lived experience over elite reputation. This is where Oprah's broader influence matters. Throughout her career, Oprah consistently created a platform for individuals, particularly women, to speak about trauma, abuse, and injustice. Her show was known for deeply emotional interviews where survivors described experiences that society often preferred to ignore. She didn't focus on scandal for spectacle. She focused on healing through truth. That cultural groundwork made it harder for powerful men to hide behind silence. The shift in media landscape. By the time Epstein's case re-entered public focus in 2018 and 2019, the media environment had changed dramatically. The Me Too movement had already exposed major figures across industries. Survivors were being believed in ways that were rare just a decade earlier. Journalists were more aggressive. Audiences were less willing to accept quiet settlements as justice. Major outlets investigated Epstein's previous plea deal and questioned how such a serious case resulted in minimal consequences. The question became unavoidable. How did a man accused of exploiting minors secure such lenient treatment? As more investigative reporting emerged, the public began demanding answers, not just about Epstein, but about the system that protected him. Oprah's broader impact on accountability culture. While Oprah did not serve as a criminal investigator in the Epstein case, her long-standing media philosophy played a powerful role in shaping the environment that allowed truths to surface. Her legacy includes centering survivor voices, challenging abuse of power, elevating conversations about trauma, encouraging public accountability. In 2018, her speech at the Golden Globes emphasized a new era of truth and justice, words that resonated deeply during the rise of abuse revelations across industries. The public was ready to listen differently. When Epstein's story regained national attention, it landed in a cultural moment primed for exposure rather than dismissal. The arrest that changed everything. In July 2019, Epstein was arrested on federal charges related to sex trafficking of minors. The charges were severe and the scrutiny intense. Suddenly, the image of untouchable wealth collapsed under the weight of evidence and testimony. The world began asking, who knew? Who enabled him? How did this continue for so long? Public discourse exploded. Documentaries were produced. Survivors came forward in greater numbers. Media outlets competed to uncover deeper layers of the network surrounding him. In this environment, voices that had spent decades emphasizing transparency, including Oprah's, helped shape how audiences processed the scandal. The conversation was no longer about gossip. It was about systemic failure. The role of media platforms. Truth does not surface automatically. It requires amplification. One of Oprah's most influential contributions to media history was demonstrating that audiences would engage deeply with difficult subjects, if handled with empathy and seriousness. Her approach transformed how trauma stories were told on television. Center the survivor. Avoid sensationalism. Ask difficult but respectful questions. Focus on healing and justice. This framework influenced countless journalists and producers who later covered stories like Epstein. When survivors of exploitation appeared in interviews across networks, the tone was different from decades past. There was less skepticism and more validation. That shift matters. The tragic end and unanswered questions. In August 2019, Epstein was found dead in his jail cell. His death was ruled a suicide, but controversy and speculation quickly followed. The sudden end intensified public suspicion. Many believed justice had been interrupted. Survivors expressed frustration that a trial would never happen. A courtroom would have revealed more names, more documents, more accountability. Instead, much remained sealed or unresolved. The focus turned to associates and facilitators. Civil lawsuits continued. The story evolved beyond one individual to examine a broader ecosystem of influence. Why this story resonated so deeply? The Epstein case was not just about criminal charges. It was about power structure. It forced society to confront uncomfortable realities. Wealth does not equal morality. Influence can distort justice. Silence can protect abuse. These themes had been central to Oprah's messaging for years, particularly in discussions about power imbalances and the importance of speaking truth. When audiences encountered the Epstein revelations, they were not starting from zero. They had been primed by years of conversations about systemic injustice. The result was collective outrage. The importance of cultural readiness. Sometimes truth exists long before it is accepted. Epstein's crimes did not begin in 2019. Allegations existed years earlier. But cultural readiness determines whether information sparks transformation or fades into obscurity. Oprah's career contributed to that readiness. By normalizing discussions about abuse and trauma in mainstream spaces, she helped dismantle stigma. Survivors watching television saw others believed and validated. That visibility builds courage. When Epstein survivors stepped forward again, the environment was more supportive than it had been in earlier years. That difference changed everything. The beginning of accountability. Although Epstein himself never stood trial, investigations into associated individuals and institutions continued. Financial settlements were reached. Documents were unsealed. Networks were examined. The broader impact was cultural. Powerful men were no longer automatically shielded by status. Media scrutiny intensified across industries. Institutions reviewed policies. Audiences became more critical consumers of influence. The conversation about justice expanded beyond one name. A turning point in public awareness. Part 1 of this story is not about assigning direct investigative credit to a single media personality. It is about understanding influence. Oprah Winfrey did not prosecute the case. She did not file charges. But her decades-long commitment to amplifying marginalized voices contributed to a societal shift where stories like Epstein's could no longer remain buried. Jeffrey Epstein thrived in secrecy. He relied on silence. He depended on disbelief. That silence eventually broke. And when it did, it broke in a media environment fundamentally different from the one that existed when his influence first grew. Explored how cultural shifts, survivor voices, and media preparedness, shaped in part by figures like Oprah Winfrey, allowed the public to confront truths previously ignored. In Part 2, we examine the broader network Epstein built, the institutions and individuals implicated, and how the media exposed a system that enabled his crimes for decades. The architecture of influence. Epstein's life was meticulously orchestrated to give him the appearance of legitimacy and power. He surrounded himself with influential people, bankers, politicians, academics, and celebrities, creating an aura of credibility. Key elements of his network included financial power. Epstein's wealth, though mysterious in origin, granted him access to private clubs, elite universities, and philanthropic boards. Donations and financial partnerships allowed him to gain trust and status. Social engineering. By cultivating friendships with figures like Bill Clinton and Donald Trump, Epstein embedded himself in circles that would discourage scrutiny. Secrecy and control. Private islands, jets, and properties were not just indulgences. They were tools to maintain secrecy, isolate victims, and intimidate potential whistleblowers. The combination of wealth, charisma, and access created a formidable shield, making the truth difficult to reach the public for years. Media investigation intensified. Once Epstein's arrest was publicized, investigative journalists began piecing together the scale of his operations. Outlets like the New York Times, the Miami Herald, and various documentaries worked tirelessly to connect the dots. The Miami Herald's investigation revealed how Epstein had previously escaped a federal conviction through a controversial plea deal, raising questions about legal favoritism. Documentary coverage provided survivors a platform to describe abuses in detail, highlighting how systemic failures enabled Epstein's continued exploitation. Digital media and social platforms allowed the story to reach global audiences quickly, amplifying survivor testimonies and public scrutiny. These investigative efforts exposed not just Epstein but a network of enablers, lawyers, employees, associates, and perhaps even institutions that turned a blind eye. Survivor voices take center stage. The cultural shift toward listening to survivors played a decisive role. Survivors were no longer secondary to elite narratives. They became the central source of truth. Many shared harrowing accounts of manipulation, coercion, and abuse. Public empathy grew, fueled by careful media coverage and sensitive storytelling. Oprah's long-standing media ethos, validating trauma and amplifying marginalized voices, had prepared audiences to receive these stories seriously. Through interviews, podcasts, and investigative shows, survivors began to name individuals who had facilitated Epstein's activities, building a broader understanding of systemic complicity. Institutions under scrutiny. Epstein's associations were not limited to individuals. Universities, research institutes, and philanthropic organizations that accepted donations came under intense scrutiny. Questions arose. Did these institutions knowingly overlook warning signs? Were they complicit in exchange for funding and prestige? How could internal policies fail to protect potential victims? Investigations revealed that many organizations had engaged in selective oversight, prioritizing reputation and donations over ethical responsibility. The scrutiny triggered a reassessment of institutional accountability, a conversation that continues today. Public reaction and global impact. The Epstein scandal provoked international attention, not just in the U.S. Citizens activists, and policymakers debated accountability at every level. Social media amplified outrage, turning the case into a symbol of wealth, power, and impunity gone unchecked. Several consequences emerged. Heightened public awareness. The case educated millions about how predators can exploit systems of influence and secrecy. Policy and legal reform. Calls for stricter oversight of plea deals, transparency in investigations, and protection of minors gained traction. Cultural shift. A societal intolerance for unchecked privilege and abuse of power began to take shape. Oprah's contributions to this shift were indirect but profound. By normalizing discussions about abuse, power, and accountability, she helped create a culture ready to confront Epstein's crimes openly. The mystery of associates. Even after Epstein's death, questions about his network persist. Associates like Ghislaine Maxwell were investigated and prosecuted, revealing layers of complicity. The media's ongoing reporting has emphasized that Epstein's actions were never isolated. He operated within a network of enablers, facilitators, and silent observers. This network's exposure underscores the importance of investigative journalism, survivor advocacy, and public vigilance in holding powerful figures accountable. The role of empathetic media leadership. Oprah's decades-long commitment to creating empathetic, survivor-centered media coverage indirectly shaped how Epstein's story was received. She demonstrated that audiences can engage deeply with difficult truths if presented responsibly, creating a model that countless journalists and producers followed during Epstein's case. Her influence reminds us that media is not just a conduit for information. It is a tool that can shape cultural norms, inspire courage, and demand accountability from those who hide behind wealth and status. Beyond Epstein, lessons in power and accountability. The Epstein case is larger than any one individual. It exposes vulnerabilities in social, legal, and institutional structures that allow abuse to thrive. Lessons include scrutiny of privilege. Wealth and influence should never grant immunity from accountability. Importance of platforms. Media platforms that amplify survivor voices play a critical role in societal change. Cultural readiness matters. Societies must be prepared to believe and act on survivor testimony. By connecting these lessons to cultural figures like Oprah, we see how media leadership and moral responsibility intersect, ultimately influencing the trajectory of justice and public perception.